to catch up to where we've been, we saw that Jesus is starting something new in Luke. You don't want to put old wine into new wineskins, right? He's starting something new, and it's kind of this all or nothing allegiance with Jesus here. And when we see that new thing and that allegiance, it's often shocking. It's shocking to the people around us, and it's shocking even to us, because it's not the new thing that Jesus is doing is not for the normal people we think. It's not the people with all the means, all the power, all the glory. It's for the people who haven't heard good news in a long time. Like it's for those. And then he kind of questions us with, how's your soil, right? Like, and it asks this question of like, you must be good soil. How's your soil doing? Are you rocky soil? Are you poor soil? Like all that stuff. And we see that Jesus turns bad soil into good. And then we see after that in the process of turning bad soil into good, we find out that Jesus is enough. That he's enough for us to rest in him. And today, we're discovering that we're not in Kansas anymore, right? That's what today is. We're not in Kansas anymore. All right. So, but to start off this sermon, you got to understand my relationship to Kansas. It's not positive at all, right? I have very, very poor relations with the state of Kansas. Now, some of you are like, you're giving me scowls. You're probably from Kansas or something like that, or you have someone nice in Kansas. No, Kansas is just one big den of sin. It just is. No one's laughing. All right, let me explain why. In St. Louis, when I was in seminary, we lived in an apartment that had exactly enough street parking on it so that if everyone parked well, everyone could park on that street, and you wouldn't have to slum it in someone else's street, all right? So that was just the way it was. Our building had like a couple of driveway spots, and a couple of the other buildings had a few driveway spots too, but if everyone did it right, and most people did, except for this mid-90s Camry with rust all over the side of it, with Kansas plates on the back of it. That person would come in and park, and I don't know how they're doing it with this one Camry, but take up like 3 places on the street, right? Like this, it was always just like we would come home in the evening, and there wouldn't be any room left, and there's except for this Kansas plated car, and I would always yell, Kansas, right? Like that's, and then something happened. When we were in Arkansas, we ended up gaining this really great friend, and she actually visited us a couple years ago, and she was down here. We're trying to get them to move down here right now. We're trying to get them out of Kansas is what we're trying to do. She's from Kansas. And some of you probably remember this, but 2 years ago, I went to her wedding. That's not her, that's actually another friend. But this is from that trip. She was getting married in the middle of nowhere, Kansas. And Kansas is horribly flat. Like here it's flat, but we got beaches, right? Kansas is flat, and there's no beaches, right? Like that. It's just flat over there. And I think I said this. Hey, Meshach, how you doing, buddy? So Kansas is. This is what happened. We got off the airplane in Kansas City. To drive to the wedding, right? And she's from the middle of nowhere, Kansas. We went north out of Kansas City, turned left into Kansas, and I'm not lying to you. This is what the GPS said. We turned left, and it goes, in 320 miles, your destination will be on the right. That's depressing. That's a state where you don't need turns, right? Like we were on a road. This wasn't the freeway. We were on a road for 320 miles. And our hotel was on that road, right? So that's like Kansas. It's just flat, right? It's just flat. And a lot of times, like, that's kind of what we think is the ideal, right? Is this a spiritual life that's just flat, like even keel and all that stuff. What I'm telling you today is that we're not in Kansas anymore. And one of the things I realized as I visited my friend Mark. Now, you guys know my friend Mark. I write all my sermons with him. He lives in Tampa now, which is awesome because he's close, and I get to see him and his two cute little twin girls. But he used to live in Seattle. Have you guys been to Seattle before? Yeah. I remember we got there at night, and I woke up, and I walked out onto his back porch of his condo he was in at the time, and you could see the Olympic Mountains from his back porch. I was like, what is this place that you live in? This is unreal. We're not in Kansas anymore, right? You get these snow-capped mountains, unreal. This was a piece, I think it was called Scenic Beach. That was 10 minutes from his house. He took us there. And I need to zoom in because those mountains look small. But if you zoom in on it, those mountains are in the clouds. And they're just right there. And I was like, it was this beautiful spot. And I was like, what is this? I was like, we're not in Kansas anymore, right? There's these huge hills and valleys, right? I think that characterizes our gospel lesson where we are in Luke in the latter half of chapter 9 is peaks and valleys, mountains and valleys. And I think that because we have the disciples, they go up to the highest of highs, and then they go right into valleys right after that. I mean, I read one of them just now. It was Jesus. Jesus asked his disciples, he's like, hey guys, who do people say that I am? Who do people say that I am? And they're like, well, some people say you're John the Baptist. Some people say you're one of the prophets. And he's like, but who do you say I am? And they're like, you're the Christ. Now remember, when you hear Christ, you have to translate that into king. Okay? They're saying you're the king. And that's the same word as Messiah. So you are the king, you are the Messiah, you are the Christ. It's the Holy One of God. And he's right. It's a mountaintop experience for Peter, right? It's great. He gets it right. It's unbelievable. And then and then Jesus continues to talk. And Peter has this huge mountaintop experience. He's finally understanding who Jesus is. And then Jesus says this, but the Son of Man, he's talking about himself, the Son of Man must suffer many things, be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and he must be killed on the third day, risen to life. Well, hold on, Jesus. Why can't you give us just a good day, Jesus? I just got something right. You're always asking us these little quizzes, and I'm never getting them right, and here I am. Why can't you just give that to us? Why do you have to talk about death and stuff? All of a sudden he goes down into a valley, right? And they didn't understand what was going on. All of a sudden they go down. Can you kind of live in that message with Peter just for a little bit? Peaks and valleys. We're not in Kansas anymore, right? Well, we continue on. We go up to another mountain, literally. Jesus takes his disciples up to the top of a mountain, and he takes them up there, and then Jesus all of a sudden gets all bright and shiny. He gets all bright and shiny, and then Moses shows up next to him, and Elijah shows up on the other side, and they're right there together. And Peter is like, "Oh my goodness, this is the most mountaintop experience one can have." Because think about what they're seeing. They've all, Peter just declared that Jesus is the Messiah, but Peter's walking around. The disciples are walking around with Jesus. They believe that he's the Messiah, but they're still acting out on faith, right? They believe that he's there, and they finally see him actually become all bright and shiny. He's transfigured before them. This is called the Transfiguration. He's transfigured before them, and Moses and Elijah, the Old Testament law and the prophets, are all around Jesus, and they're like, it's finally happening. This is so great. And they're so elated that they begin to make poor decisions. Have you guys ever had such a good time? Such a mountaintop experience that you didn't make a poor decision. Maybe at a party or something like that. Like that's you make a poor decision. That's what Peter does. It says that he goes, Jesus, we got to make, this is so great for us to be here. We got to make 3 shelters. We got to make 3 little places to worship you in there. And I love what Luke says. He says, Peter didn't know what he was talking about. That's such shade being thrown from another side, right? Like don't listen to Peter on that. He didn't know what he was actually talking about. And it's this huge mountaintop experience, and it's this beautiful scene, this transfiguration, because the cloud of God descends on top of that mountain, envelops them all, and God, which is Exodus language, and God speaks out of it. He says, "This is my son, listen to him." This is my son, listen. It's a mountaintop experience for him. I don't know, Toto. I don't think we're in Kansas anymore, right? It's a mountaintop experience. Well, they continue on, and they go right into a valley, because the very next story is Jesus. This man comes up to Jesus. He's like, Jesus, my son is filled with a demon. Like and it's awful, and it's shaking him, and it's bruising him, and we can't get the demon to come out, and it's convulsing him, and it's awful. And then he says this, can you come and deal with it? Because your disciples tried, and they failed. Now, what's interesting about this? Do you guys remember what we talked about last week? Jesus sent out his disciples to give good news to the poor, right? But also what? To cast out demons. And were they successful at that? Yeah, it seems like they were. And now they're on this mountaintop experience. You know, when you're like, everything's clicking and then everything's perfect, it's like, I can conquer the world today, you know? Like, things are good today. My knee's not hurting or something like that, right? And like, it's like, we could do all this. And then all of a sudden, bam, a roadblock, right? You're in a valley. Imagine what the disciples feel. And then Jesus is like, okay, I'll heal your son. I'll heal your son. And did you guys catch, if you've read this before, what he says to them? He goes, you faithless and perverse generation, how much longer do I have to stay here? Like that's like, oh my gosh, right? Like the disciples like, geez, come on, man. Like we're trying our best, you know? Like that's, it's all of a sudden they're back in the valley. You faithless generation, gut punch, right? It's like, oh, come on. And then they quickly go back to a peak. Jesus heals the son. Everything is great. And then Jesus starts talking about his death again. Peaks and valleys. Toto, we're not in Kansas anymore. Peaks and valleys. And then there's another peak. Yeah, you know what it is? It's a peak that the disciples created themselves. Do you know what they started to do? They started to talk to each other and argue about which one of them was the best. Think about that for a second. What has transpired? So they go out, Jesus sends them out, they do all these amazing things, they come back, they totally whiff it on the feeding of the 5,000, but Jesus, lets them take part in that, and so they were like, yeah, all right. And then they understand who Jesus is, but then Jesus talks about his death, and then they really miss it on the shelters thing, and then they really miss it on the exercising the demons thing. They really miss all that, and Jesus keeps talking about his death and all that stuff, and they're like, and then they start talking about, it's like, hey, Jerry, I'm really better than you. Yeah, I'm the most humble one in the room here. Like that's like, did you see that one guy with that one demon, the one that had like the weird orange eyes and stuff like that? Like I took care of him, right? Like that, all of a sudden they start talking about this. And you could see Jesus in the corner, just like with a face palm, It's like, oh, come on, guys. he's like, do I need to show you this again? And he grabs some children and he says, you got to come like a child. For it's the one who is the least among you all that is the greatest. He goes, it's a race to the bottom, guys. That's the greatest. It's not the highest. It's not it's not about all of those. It's about who's the least is actually the greatest. And what's interesting about Luke right here, after he says that, it does this good summary statement right in Luke chapter 9, verse 51. And it says that Jesus set his eyes to Jerusalem. Now, the reason why I think that's so interesting is we have these peaks and valleys in our own lives, right? Like have you guys had those mountaintop experiences? Perhaps you went to a camp or you were, I don't know, a certain point in time and you're like, you could do nothing wrong. Like everything you touched was turning to gold, right? Everything was just going great. Or how about like you having that mountaintop experience in your faith life? Every time you open up the Bible, like you see new things. Every time you pray, you find yourself like, oh man, I prayed forever just then. It felt like it went by like a second. Like I'm on a mountaintop experience. And then there's the other sides, the valleys, right? When you open up the Bible and it feels like dust in your hands. When you come to church and you're listening to the pastor who's unbelievably eloquent and unbelievable, right? And it just falls on deaf ears, right? And it's just I can't get anything out of it. Like you try to pray and it feels like you've been praying for 3 hours and you've been praying for about 5 seconds. And you're in that valley and you just feel like you're in a valley of dry bones. You just feel like you're in a valley of shadow of death. Right? Like you feel like you're in there and just nothing is working out, and you feel envious and covetousness of people who seem like their spiritual house is more in order than yours. And you're just like, how can this be? But Jesus set his eyes to Jerusalem. And this is what I love about the gospel message, is that Peter's last interaction with Jesus, was it positive or negative? Do you guys remember? It is negative, right? Peter's last interaction in the story before Jesus dies, he's like, listen, I don't know the man, right? Sitting around a flaming barrel. I don't know the man. I don't know who that is. He does that 3 times. And that's what I think we see the story. Is that the story is that all of us, we're gonna be like, we're gonna have peaks and valleys. We're not gonna be in Kansas, right? Or our spiritual life is gonna have peaks and valleys in it. There's gonna be times when we feel like we're on top of the world. There's gonna be times when we feel like we're in the valley of the shadow of death. And what we see in Jesus is that he didn't walk in Jerusalem to the tip top of the throne all over Rome, all over. He walked into the valley of the shadow of death so that he might be with us there and lead us out and give us a resurrection, give us a redemption, give us a new life in him. He meets us down in that valley so that we can fear no evil, right? Because his rod, his cross, is there to protect us from anything that would befall on us. So, to end here. Peaks and valleys. Some of you are on a mountaintop experience right now. And things are going well. Things are like everything is wonderful. You're like, oh my goodness, I can't get enough of this, and just life is going well and all that stuff. I'm here to tell you, that's awesome. Those are amazing things. I want you to hear the simple message. Hang on, the valley's coming. Right? For those of you that are in the valley, hang on. The mountain's coming. Hang on. The valley is not the final word. And the thing that we see with Jesus in the cross is that he meets you down in the valley. And this is why it's good that we're all here together. Because some of you are on the valley right now and some of you are on a mountain. For those of you on the mountain right now, find those that are in the valley and sit next to them. Sit with them. Be the hands and feet and the love of Jesus as they go through whatever struggle they're going through. And those of you in the valley, don't push the hands and feet of Jesus away. Let them hold on to you as they attempt to sit with you in your struggle. Because God uses all of us in the different stages of our lives so that we may all move together in his glory. Because we are his one body of Christ. So God loves you all. And he is with you, whether your spiritual life is on top of that mountain or it feels like it's dry in that valley. He is with you. And I think I'll end